I want to tell you about the night I discovered that being invisible can sometimes be the greatest superpower of all. It was at my sister Jessica's wedding, surrounded by 300 guests in designer gowns and $1,000 suits, when Forbes magazine decided to announce to the world that the quiet girl they'd relegated to the corner table was worth more than everyone in that ballroom combined. But this story isn't about money, it's about the moment I realized that the people who spent 26 years making me feel small had actually been preparing me to stand tall. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as Emma Rodriguez in the pristine suburbs of Westlake Hills, Austin, I learned early that love in our family operated on a sliding scale, not because anyone sat me down and explained the rules, but because the evidence accumulated like dust on furniture you stopped noticing. Small moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but together painted a picture so clear it became the wallpaper of my childhood. My younger sister Jessica was the sun around which our family solar system revolved, and I was something more like a distant moon, necessary for balance perhaps, but rarely acknowledged for my own light. The pattern revealed itself in ways both obvious and subtle. When Jessica wanted the last piece of cake, our mother Linda would gently suggest I'd probably had enough sweets anyway. When Jessica broke my art project for the school science fair, Linda's response was a tired sigh and the familiar refrain that accidents happen, followed by the expectation that I would simply start over. When Jessica threw spectacular tantrums in grocery stores, Linda would scoop her up with understanding murmurs about being overwhelmed, while my own tears were met with sharp reminders about setting a good example as the older sister. Our father Mark operated differently but with the same result. Where Linda's favoritism wore soft edges, his was architectural, built into the very structure of how our household functioned. Jessica's bedroom occupied the corner of our house with windows facing both east and south, flooding the space with natural light throughout the day. My room, smaller and darker, looked out onto the neighbor's fence. When I mentioned this once, Mark explained that Jessica needed the bigger space because she had more friends over. I didn't point out that she had more friends over because she had the bigger space to host them. I was 13, and already understood that logic in our house flowed in only one direction. The disparity followed us through adolescence like a shadow that grew longer with each passing year. Jessica's high school experience included a red BMW convertible for her 16th birthday, a generous clothing allowance that refreshed itself seasonally, and parents who attended every single one of her dance recitals and soccer games with cameras and flowers. My own milestones were met with practical acknowledgments. When I made honor roll for the 4th consecutive semester, Linda hung the certificate on the refrigerator next to Jessica's participation trophy from volleyball camp. When I won the regional debate championship, Mark mentioned it briefly during dinner and then asked Jessica about her upcoming audition for the school musical. The financial inequality became impossible to ignore as we approached college age. Jessica's path was paved with comfort and opportunity. She spent her junior year researching universities based on campus beauty and social life rankings, secure in the knowledge that tuition would be handled. Her college visits included weekend trips to Dallas and Houston, staying in nice hotels and eating at restaurants that required reservations. When she finally chose Southern Methodist University, Linda and Mark celebrated as though Jessica had won a scholarship rather than simply selected the most expensive option available. My own college planning happened quietly and independently. I researched schools based on merit aid availability and in-state tuition rates. I filled out financial aid forms alone at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed, calculating work-study opportunities and meal plan costs with the precision of someone who knew that every dollar mattered. When I was accepted to the University of Texas with a partial academic scholarship, Linda said it was wonderful and immediately shifted the conversation to Jessica's upcoming formal dress shopping. The University of Texas campus became my sanctuary, a place where my worth wasn't predetermined by family hierarchy. I threw myself into computer science classes with the hunger of someone finally allowed to be excellent without apology. While Jessica posted sorority photos and spring break trips funded by regular deposits from home, I worked 2 part-time jobs and spent my free time in the engineering lab, building skills and connections that felt like investments in a future only I could see. My professors noticed what my family never had. Dr. Sarah Winters, who taught advanced programming, pulled me aside after a particularly complex project and asked if I'd considered graduate school. Professor James Liu invited me to join his research team, where I learned about artificial intelligence and machine learning applications that seemed like science fiction to most people, but felt like coming home to me. These mentors saw potential in me that I'd stopped believing existed, and slowly, carefully, I began to rebuild my sense of self around their encouragement rather than my family's indifference. Jessica's college years unfolded like a movie montage of everything mine weren't. She pledged the most exclusive sorority, dated the president of the most prestigious fraternity, and spent her summers on study abroad programs in Europe that looked more like extended vacations based on her Instagram posts. Linda and Mark visited her frequently, taking her and her friends out for expensive dinners and shopping excursions. They attended her sorority formals and homecoming celebrations, beaming with pride as they posed for photos with their beautiful popular daughter. Meanwhile,
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in computer science and a job offer from a promising tech startup in downtown Austin. Linda mentioned my graduation in passing to her book club friends, the same tone she might use to mention that the landscaping service had done a nice job with the hedges. Mark asked once if my new job had good benefits, then returned his attention to Jessica's latest drama with her roommate's situation. The startup, called Innovate Tech, occupied a converted warehouse in East Austin, where young programmers gathered around ping-pong tables and cold brew coffee dispensers, building applications that solved problems most people didn't even know they had. I loved the energy, the collaboration, the sense that we were creating something meaningful together. My colleagues became the family I'd never had, people who valued intelligence and creativity over appearance and social connections. 2 years into my job at Innovate Tech, I noticed inefficiencies in how we managed client relationships and project timelines. Working nights and weekends, I developed a software solution that streamlined communications and automated routine tasks. When I presented it to our leadership team, they were so impressed they offered me equity in the company and a promotion to lead developer. More importantly, they encouraged me to think about spinning my innovation into its own company. That's how Rodriguez Tech Solutions was born, quietly and without fanfare, in my small apartment in East Austin. I told my family I was doing some freelance consulting work, which wasn't technically untrue. What I didn't mention was that my consulting involved building a revolutionary project management platform that companies across Texas were beginning to adopt at rates that surprised even me. Within 18 months, Rodriguez Tech had 12 employees and revenue that exceeded my wildest projections. Jessica, meanwhile, had graduated from SMU with a communications degree and moved back into the guest house behind our parents' main home in Westlake Hills. She worked part-time at a boutique marketing firm that specialized in social media management for local businesses, a job that Linda described to friends as very creative and flexible. Mark had offered Jessica a position at Rodriguez Construction Company, but she'd declined, saying she wanted to pursue her passion for digital marketing. What she actually pursued were long brunches with college friends and weekend trips to Dallas for shopping and nightlife. The engagement announcement came on a Tuesday evening in March. Jessica had been dating Trevor Hamilton, whose family owned a chain of successful car dealerships across Central Texas, for just over a year. Their relationship played out like a romantic comedy on social media, with elaborate date nights and weekend getaways that always seemed perfectly lit and professionally photographed. When Trevor proposed at the top of Mount Bonnell, with the Austin skyline glittering below them, Linda cried tears of joy and immediately began planning what she called the wedding of the century. The wedding preparations consumed our family's attention for the better part of a year. Linda took a leave of absence from her part-time job at the art gallery to focus on coordinating vendors and managing details. Mark worked overtime at the construction company to cover costs that escalated weekly as Jessica's vision expanded to include ice sculptures, a string quartet, and a 7-course dinner designed by a James Beard-nominated chef. Every family dinner became a planning session. Every conversation eventually circled back to flowers or seating arrangements or the ongoing drama of Jessica's quest for the perfect dress. I offered to help with various aspects of the planning, hoping to find some way to contribute to this massive family effort. Linda politely declined my offers with explanations that made sense individually, but together painted a familiar picture. The website design could be handled by Trevor's cousin, who was more familiar with their aesthetic vision. The budget spreadsheets were already set up in a system that worked for Linda. The vendor coordination required someone who could be available during business hours for site visits and tastings. Alex Chen, who I'd been dating for 2 years, watched these interactions with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a foreign culture. Alex worked as a financial analyst at a downtown investment firm and had grown up in a family where achievements were celebrated equally and contributions were welcomed regardless of birth order. After a particularly frustrating family dinner where Jessica spent 20 minutes debating the merits of peonies versus garden roses, while I sat silent, Alex quietly asked if I was okay with being so excluded from my sister's wedding planning. The question surprised me because I hadn't consciously acknowledged my exclusion as deliberate. I'd simply accepted it as natural, the way I'd accepted countless other small rejections throughout my life. But Alex's outside perspective helped me see what I'd trained myself not to notice. My family had planned around me rather than with me, creating a celebration that would showcase Jessica while keeping me safely in the background where I'd always belonged. The invitation arrived in my mailbox 6 weeks before the wedding, formal and beautiful with Jessica's name embossed in gold script across the top. Inside, along with the ceremony and reception details, was a small card indicating my table assignment. Table 12. I didn't think much of it until Alex mentioned that Table 12 seemed far from the action, tucked in the back corner of the ballroom layout Linda had enthusiastically shown us on her phone. When I asked Linda about the seating arrangements, she explained that they'd had to be very strategic about grouping people, and Table 12 was where they'd placed family friends and cousins who don't get together often. Later I discovered through Jessica's friend Madison, who was handling some of the coordination details, exactly who would be sitting at Table 12. My cousin Roberto, who lived in San Antonio and hadn't spoken to anyone in the family since our grandfather's funeral 3 years ago. Mark's elderly Aunt Helen, who had early-stage dementia and required assistance with most activities. 2 of Jessica's childhood friends' boyfriends who hadn't met anyone else in the wedding party. And me, the sister of the bride, seated among the social periphery, like an afterthought rather than immediate family. The realization settled over me with the weight of accumulated disappointments. 26 years of being overlooked had led to this moment, where my own sister's wedding planners had categorized me as optional company, someone whose presence was necessary but whose comfort and happiness were secondary considerations. I wasn't angry exactly. Anger requires surprise, and there was nothing surprising about being treated as less important than Jessica's college roommate's boyfriend or Trevor's business partner's wife, both of whom had been seated at table 4, within easy conversation distance of the head table. Alex wanted me to say something to Linda or Mark about the seating arrangement. Alex couldn't understand how parents could place their own daughter so far from the celebration, among people who were essentially strangers. But I'd learned long ago that challenging my family's decisions only resulted in elaborate explanations that made me feel selfish for asking. Better to accept Table 12 and focus on the positive aspects of the celebration. Jessica was happy, Linda and Mark were proud, and I could support my family by being graciously present without causing complications. The week before the wedding, something happened that changed everything, though I wouldn't understand the significance until much later. Forbes magazine published their annual 30 Under 30 Inches feature, highlighting young entrepreneurs who were reshaping various industries. I'd been interviewed months earlier by a journalist who was researching innovative tech solutions in smaller markets outside of Silicon Valley. The interview had been brief and focused on Rodriguez Tech's growth trajectory and industry impact. I'd mentioned it to my family in passing, describing it as a small business publication interested in local success stories. What I hadn't anticipated was the scope of Forbes's research or their access to financial databases that revealed information I'd kept private even from my closest friends. The article, when it published online that Wednesday morning, included details about Rodriguez Tech's valuation and my personal stake in the company that I'd never discussed publicly. According to Forbes's calculations, my shares in Rodriguez Tech, combined with the intellectual property rights to my original software platform, made me worth approximately $12 million at age 26. The article also revealed that I'd been quietly diversifying my investments, working with Alex's firm to build a portfolio that included real estate holdings and tech startup investments across Texas. What Forbes presented as a success story of young entrepreneurship in Austin's growing tech scene was actually the documentation of my financial independence from a family that had never suspected I needed independence from them. The Forbes article went live at 7 in the morning, and by 8:30 my phone was buzzing with congratulatory messages from colleagues, former professors and business contacts I hadn't heard from in months. The notifications kept coming throughout the day, a steady stream of LinkedIn connection requests and interview invitations from publications I'd only dreamed of being featured in. My assistant at Rodriguez Tech called to say that 3 major venture capital firms had already reached out about potential partnerships, and our company email was flooded with inquiries from businesses wanting to license our platform. What struck me most was how none of these people seemed surprised by the revelation. My success felt inevitable to them, a natural progression of the work they'd witnessed me doing over the past several years. Dr. Winters sent a text saying she'd always known I was destined for something extraordinary. Professor Liu forwarded the article to his entire graduate program, with a note about the importance of recognizing potential in unexpected places. My colleagues at Innovate Tech, where I still maintained advisory relationships, shared the article on social media with comments about how they'd watched me build something revolutionary from the ground up. The contrast was stark when I considered my family's complete ignorance of these developments. Linda and Mark knew I worked in technology and assumed I made a decent living, but they'd never asked for specifics about my company or shown interest in the details of my professional life. Jessica occasionally made jokes about my computer stuff when friends asked what I did for work, always with a slight eye roll that suggested she found my career choice both boring and slightly embarrassing. They'd never visited my office, never asked to see the platform I'd developed, never shown curiosity about the industry that had become my passion and my path to independence. The morning of Jessica's wedding, I woke up in my East Austin apartment to find that the Forbes article had been shared over 2,000 times overnight. The comments section was filled with praise for young women in tech and discussions about Austin's growing reputation as a startup hub. Several female entrepreneurs had reached out through Instagram and Twitter, asking if I'd be interested in speaking at conferences or mentoring other women looking to break into technology. The response was overwhelming in the best possible way, validation from strangers who understood the significance of what I'd built. I chose my outfit for the wedding carefully, settling on a navy blue dress that Alex had helped me pick out weeks earlier. It was elegant without being flashy, appropriate for a formal celebration without competing for attention. As I applied my makeup and styled my hair in the bathroom mirror, I caught myself thinking about how different this day felt from what I'd expected. Instead of dreading hours of feeling invisible at table 12, I felt calm and centered, anchored by the knowledge that my worth wasn't determined by my family's perception of me. Alex picked me up at noon, looking handsome in a charcoal gray suit that brought out the warm brown of his eyes. Alex had seen the Forbes article and understood its significance not just financially but emotionally. For 2 years, Alex had watched me navigate family dynamics that minimized my achievements and questioned my choices. Now the rest of the world was celebrating what my family had never bothered to notice. Alex squeezed my hand as we drove toward the Driscoll Hotel and quietly said that today was going to be interesting in ways my family couldn't possibly anticipate. The Driscolls' ballroom had been transformed into something that belonged in a magazine spread about luxury weddings. Cream and blush pink roses cascaded from tall centerpieces, and crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in silk linens. A string quartet played softly near the entrance, and servers in black tie uniforms circulated with champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres. Everything was perfect in the way that only unlimited budgets and months of planning could achieve. Linda had succeeded in creating the wedding of her dreams, a celebration that would be talked about in Westlake Hill's social circles for years to come. Jessica looked radiant in a dress that had required 3 fittings and cost more than I'd spent on rent in 6 months. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo that had taken 2 hours to complete, and her makeup was flawless in the way that only professional artists could achieve. She moved through the reception like a princess greeting her subjects, accepting congratulations and compliments with the gracious confidence of someone who had always been the center of attention. Trevor stood beside her in a custom tuxedo, beaming with the satisfaction of a man who had married exactly the kind of woman he'd always imagined himself with. Linda and Mark flanked the receiving line, glowing with pride as they introduced Jessica and Trevor to guests who were meeting them for the first time. Linda wore a champagne-colored gown that she'd spent weeks selecting, and Mark had invested in a new tuxedo for the occasion. They looked like the successful, devoted parents they'd always aspired to be, presiding over a celebration that showcased their daughter's beauty and their family's prosperity. Every detail had been orchestrated to reinforce the narrative they'd constructed about their lives and their values. I made my way through the crowd toward table 12, exchanging pleasantries with relatives I saw only at major family events and wedding guests who knew me primarily as Jessica's older sister. The conversations were brief and polite, focused mainly on how beautiful Jessica looked and how elegant the celebration was. No one mentioned the Forbes article, though I noticed a few curious glances when people heard my name. The business and technology communities in Austin were smaller than people realized, and some of these guests had likely seen the coverage or heard about it through their own professional networks. Table 12 was exactly where I'd expected it to be, tucked in the back corner of the ballroom with a partially obstructed view of the head table. My fellow table assignments were already seated when Alex and I arrived. Cousin Roberto looked uncomfortable in a suit that didn't quite fit, checking his phone frequently and avoiding eye contact with other guests. Aunt Helen sat quietly beside her caregiver, occasionally commenting on how pretty the flowers were or asking where she was. The boyfriends of Jessica's friends made awkward conversation about sports and weather, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. The dynamics at table 12 perfectly illustrated everything I'd learned about my place in the family hierarchy. We were the forgotten ones, the social obligations, the people who needed to be included for appearance sake, but whose comfort and enjoyment were afterthoughts. The conversation was stilted and fragmented, a collection of strangers trying to make the best of an awkward situation. I found myself playing hostess, asking questions and facilitating introductions, trying to create some sense of connection among people who had nothing in common except their peripheral relationship to the bride and groom. As the cocktail hour progressed, I watched my family work the room like seasoned politicians. Linda moved from table to table, ensuring that important guests felt appreciated and that every detail was proceeding smoothly. Mark held court near the bar, sharing stories about Jessica's childhood and accepting congratulations on raising such a wonderful daughter. Jessica and Trevor posed for endless photographs, their smiles never wavering as they repeated the same grateful responses to the same enthusiastic compliments. What struck me most was how natural it all looked, how perfectly my family had mastered the art of social performance. They knew exactly who to spend time with, and how long to linger at each conversation. They understood which guests required special attention, and which ones could be acknowledged with a smile and wave. They moved through the celebration with the confidence of people who had always known how to navigate these situations, who had been preparing for this moment their entire lives. The contrast with my own experience was profound. While they commanded attention and respect, I sat virtually invisible at a table that might as well have been in a different room. While they basked in congratulations and admiration, I made small talk with people who were clearly as marginalized as I was. While they celebrated Jessica's happiness and success, I reflected on how completely they had written me out of their story of family achievement and connection. During dinner, the speeches began with Trevor's best man telling charming stories about their college friendship and Jessica's maid of honor sharing memories of their sorority adventures. Mark's father of the bride's speech was polished and heartfelt, describing Jessica as his precious daughter, who had brought joy and laughter to their family since the day she was born. He talked about watching her grow into a beautiful, intelligent woman who deserved every happiness life could offer. He thanked Trevor for recognizing Jessica's special qualities and promised to welcome him into their family with open arms. Linda's speech was shorter but equally emotional, focusing on Jessica's kindness and creativity and expressing gratitude for the wonderful man she had chosen to marry. She talked about the excitement of planning this celebration and how proud she was to see Jessica surrounded by so many people who loved her. She raised her champagne glass and toasted to Jessica and Trevor's future together, wishing them a lifetime of love and laughter. Neither speech mentioned me, not even in passing reference to family or siblings. I hadn't expected to be featured prominently, but the complete absence of acknowledgement felt deliberate rather than accidental. In their version of Jessica's story, I simply didn't exist as a meaningful character. I was background noise, furniture part of the setting but not part of the narrative that mattered to them. Alex noticed my reaction and reached for my hand under the table, providing silent support as I processed the reality of my invisibility. Around us, guests dabbed at their eyes and murmured appreciation for the beautiful words and obvious love between parents and daughter. The speeches were genuinely moving if you didn't know about the other daughter sitting 50 feet away, watching her own parents celebrate a family that apparently didn't include her. The dancing began with Jessica and Trevor's first dance to a song they'd chosen because it was playing during their first date. They moved together beautifully, having taken lessons to prepare for this moment, and the guests watched with the kind of romantic appreciation that made everyone remember why they loved weddings. Linda and Mark joined them for the traditional parent dances, beaming with happiness as they swayed to music that had been carefully selected to represent their relationships with Jessica. I excused myself from table 12 and walked toward the bathroom, needing a moment away from the celebration to collect my thoughts. The hallway outside the ballroom was quieter, decorated with the same elegant flowers and soft lighting but without the overwhelming energy of 300 people celebrating. I stood near a window overlooking downtown Austin, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, and trying to reconcile the woman I'd become with the invisible daughter my family still saw when they looked at me. That's when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. Linda was standing near the coat check with two of her closest friends, women I'd known since childhood who had watched Jessica and me grow up in their social circle. They were discussing the wedding details and praising Linda's planning skills when one of them mentioned seeing something about me in the news. I saw Emma's name in Forbes magazine this week, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the curious tone of someone fishing for information. Something about technology companies in Austin. I didn't know she was involved in anything so prominent. Linda's response was immediate and dismissive. Oh, that was just some little article about local businesses. You know how these publications are always looking for stories? Emma does some computer consulting work, nothing too exciting. Jessica's always been our entrepreneur, really? She has such natural business instincts. Mrs. Martinez nodded sympathetically. It must be hard having two daughters with such different ambitions. Jessica's always been so outgoing and confident. Emma's more, well, she's always been the quiet one, hasn't she? Exactly. Linda agreed, her voice warming with the pleasure of being understood. Emma's very sweet, but she's never had Jessica's drive or social skills. We're just grateful she found something she enjoys doing with computers. And Alex seems like a nice enough young man, though not quite what we'd hoped for Jessica when she was dating. The conversation continued, but I stopped listening after Linda's casual dismissal of my life's work as some computer consulting. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that my family's ignorance about my success wasn't accidental or temporary. It was willful and protective, a deliberate choice to maintain the narrative that positioned Jessica as the accomplished daughter and me as the pleasant afterthought who had stumbled into adequate employment. They had never asked about Rodriguez Tech because they didn't want to know. They had never shown interest in my achievements because acknowledging them would require adjusting their fundamental understanding of who we were as a family. In their story, Jessica was the star and I was the supporting character, and my actual accomplishments threatened that carefully constructed dynamic in ways they weren't prepared to handle. I returned to table 12 feeling strangely liberated rather than hurt. Linda's conversation had revealed the truth I'd suspected, but never fully accepted. My family's treatment of me wasn't based on my actual qualities or achievements, but on their need to maintain Jessica as the center of their universe. No amount of success or recognition would change their perception because their perception wasn't based on evidence. It was based on a story they'd decided to tell themselves about who we were and what we meant to them. The evening continued around me with increasing revelry as guests moved between dancing and drinking and animated conversations about business and relationships and shared memories. Jessica held court at the head table, surrounded by her wedding party and closest friends, glowing with the happiness of someone whose dreams were all coming true exactly as she'd imagined them. Linda and Mark mingled effortlessly among their guests, accepting compliments on the beautiful celebration and their wonderful daughter with the gracious confidence of people who had achieved exactly what they'd set out to accomplish. I found myself observing the celebration with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying unfamiliar customs. These were my people, my family, my history, but I felt no emotional connection to their joy or their success. I was happy for Jessica in the abstract way you might be happy for a stranger's good fortune, and I was proud of Linda and Mark for creating something beautiful, but their celebration felt separate from my life in fundamental ways I was only beginning to understand. Alex and I danced a few times, talked with the other guests at our table, and participated in the wedding traditions that required everyone's involvement. We caught the bouquet toss from the back of the crowd, applauded during the cake cutting, and joined the group photo of all the family members that would later hang in Linda and Mark's living room. We played our roles perfectly, contributing to the evening's success without drawing attention to ourselves or creating any complications for the bride and groom. But underneath the pleasant surface, I was processing a shift in my understanding of myself and my relationships that felt seismic in its implications. For 26 years, I had measured my worth against my family's expectations and found myself consistently falling short. I had internalized their indifference as evidence of my own inadequacy, believing that if I could just achieve enough or contribute enough or become enough, they would finally see me as valuable and worthy of their attention and pride. The Forbes article had changed that equation completely. For the first time in my life, I had objective evidence that my worth wasn't determined by my family's perception of me. $12 million and recognition from one of the most respected business publications in the world couldn't be dismissed as computer consulting or explained away as luck or timing. My success was real and substantial and entirely independent of their approval or acknowledgement. More importantly, I realized that I had built this success precisely because I had learned to function without their validation. Years of being overlooked had taught me to rely on my own judgment and trust my own instincts. Years of being dismissed had motivated me to prove myself in environments where merit mattered more than family dynamics. Years of being invisible had given me the freedom to pursue my own path without the pressure of living up to their expectations or conforming to their vision of who I should become. As the evening wound down and guests began saying their goodbyes, I felt a profound sense of closure settling over me. This wedding represented the culmination of everything my family valued: beauty, tradition, social status, and the preservation of their carefully curated image of success and happiness. Jessica had delivered exactly what they'd always wanted from her, and they had celebrated her achievement with the kind of elaborate recognition I had spent my life hoping to earn. But I no longer needed their recognition because I had something more valuable: the knowledge that I had created my own definition of success and achieved it entirely on my own terms. I had built a company that solved real problems and created value for others. I had accumulated wealth that provided security and independence. I had earned respect from peers who understood my industry and appreciated my contributions. I had found love with someone who saw and valued exactly who I was. The realization was both liberating and melancholy, like graduating from a school you'd never really liked but had attended for so long it felt like home. I was ready to leave table 12 and everything it represented, but saying goodbye meant acknowledging that I had never really belonged in the first place. The conversation that would change everything started innocuously enough. Mrs. Davidson, one of Linda's book club friends who worked in public relations for a major Austin corporation, approached our table during the dessert course with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she had something specific on her mind. She was an elegant woman in her 50s who had always been polite to me at family gatherings, though our interactions rarely extended beyond pleasantries about school or work. "Emma dear," she said, her voice carrying a note of excitement that seemed out of proportion to our usual exchanges. "I've been trying to catch you all evening. I had to come over and congratulate you personally on the Forbes feature. What an incredible achievement for someone so young." The words hung in the air like a record scratch at a dance party. Conversations at nearby tables didn't exactly stop, but I noticed a subtle shift in attention, the way people's ears perk up when they sense something interesting might be happening. Alex squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture of support that acknowledged we were entering uncharted territory. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my voice neutral and pleasant. It was certainly unexpected to receive that kind of recognition. Mrs. Davidson's enthusiasm was genuine and infectious. "Unexpected? Honey, you're being too modest. $12 million at 26 years old. Building a tech company from scratch, you should be shouting it from the rooftops. I've been in business communications for 30 years and I can tell you that kind of success doesn't happen by accident." The number landed like a small explosion across the immediate area. I watched the information ripple outward through the nearby guests, their expressions shifting from polite interest to surprise to a kind of recalibrating attention that I'd never experienced from this crowd. Cousin Roberto actually looked up from his phone for the first time all evening. Aunt Helen, despite her confusion about most things, seemed to register that something significant was being discussed. "Forbes called your platform revolutionary," Mrs. Davidson continued, clearly enjoying her role as the bearer of impressive news. "They said Rodriguez Tech Solutions is positioned to transform how mid-sized companies manage their operations. That's not small potatoes, Emma, that's industry-changing innovation." Alex joined the conversation with the smooth professionalism that made him excellent at his job. "Emma's been remarkably humble about her success. She's built something truly special, but she rarely talks about the recognition it's been receiving." "Well, she should talk about it," Mrs. Davidson declared. "Young women in technology need role models, and Emma's exactly the kind of success story that inspires others. I've already forwarded the article to my daughter in college. She's been hesitant about pursuing computer science, but seeing someone like Emma excel in that field might give her the confidence she needs." I could feel the energy at table 12 shifting as this conversation unfolded. The disconnected strangers who had been making awkward small talk for the past 3 hours were suddenly united in their fascination with this unexpected revelation. The boyfriends of Jessica's friends were looking at me with new interest, probably calculating whether they should have been paying more attention to the quiet woman in the navy dress. Even the caregiver helping Aunt Helen was listening intently, perhaps recognizing that this was the kind of moment that would be worth remembering. Mrs. Davidson's voice carried enough that guests at adjacent tables were beginning to tune in as well. I noticed heads turning and conversations pausing as people tried to piece together what they were overhearing. The name Forbes had a way of cutting through wedding reception chatter, especially when it was being associated with someone they'd previously categorized as unimportant. "I have to ask," Mrs. Davidson said, leaning in conspiratorially, "how did you manage to keep this so quiet? I mean, your parents must be absolutely bursting with pride. I can't imagine Linda being able to resist bragging about having a daughter featured in Forbes magazine." The question was innocent enough, but it highlighted the elephant in the room that I'd been trying to ignore all evening. Mrs. Davidson genuinely couldn't comprehend why Linda hadn't mentioned my success, why it hadn't been part of the wedding celebration conversation, why the mother of a Forbes featured entrepreneur hadn't found a way to work that information into her social interactions. My family prefers to keep business matters private, I said carefully, trying to navigate between honesty and loyalty. Tonight is about Jessica and Trevor, and that's exactly as it should be. But Mrs. Davidson was too excited to be deterred by diplomatic deflection. Oh, of course you're absolutely right to focus on the celebration, but surely this calls for its own celebration. Linda, you must be planning something special to honor Emma's achievement. That's when I realized Linda was standing directly behind Mrs. Davidson, close enough to have heard every word of our conversation. Her face wore the frozen smile of someone who had been caught completely off guard, and was frantically trying to calculate the appropriate response. Mark appeared beside her, his expression equally uncertain, though his discomfort manifested as a tightness around his eyes rather than Linda's brittle cheerfulness. "Oh, we're incredibly proud of Emma," Linda said, her voice hitting all the right notes of maternal warmth while her eyes conveyed something closer to panic. "She's always been so dedicated to her work." Mrs. Davidson beamed, clearly delighted to have the bride's parents join the conversation. Dedicated is an understatement. According to Forbes, she's created something that could revolutionize project management across multiple industries. And at such a young age, you must have known she was building something special. Mark cleared his throat, the way he did when he was buying time to formulate a response. "Emma's always been very focused on her computer projects. We're proud of all our daughter's accomplishments." The phrase computer projects landed awkwardly in a conversation about Forbes recognition and $12 million valuations. I watched Mrs. Davidson's expression shift slightly as she registered the disconnect between the magnitude of my achievement and my parents' oddly casual response. She was too polite to point out the discrepancy directly, but her enthusiasm cooled noticeably as she sensed undercurrents she didn't understand. "Well," she said, her tone becoming more measured, "I hope you know how remarkable your daughter's success is. In my line of work, I see a lot of young professionals, and Emma's achievement is truly exceptional." Linda nodded vigorously, as if enthusiastic agreement could compensate for her obvious lack of knowledge about what exactly she was agreeing with. "Yes, absolutely, we've always known Emma was special." But the damage was done. Mrs. Davidson's journalist instincts had picked up on the story beneath the story, and her questions were becoming more pointed even as her tone remained friendly. "Have you had a chance to read the full Forbes piece? The business analysis is fascinating. Emma's approach to solving communication inefficiencies is apparently years ahead of her competitors." "We've been so busy with wedding preparations," Linda said, the excuse sounding thin even to her own ears. "But we certainly plan to read it thoroughly." Mrs. Davidson looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, you haven't read it yet? It published on Wednesday. I would have thought, well, I suppose you have had your hands full with this beautiful celebration." The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken implications. Here was a family friend who had taken the time to read about my success and come congratulate me personally, while my own parents were admitting they hadn't even looked at an article that had been public for 3 days. The optics were impossible to ignore, especially for someone like Mrs. Davidson who understood public relations and family dynamics. Alex stepped into the breach with characteristic grace. "Emma's been focused on supporting Jessica's wedding rather than promoting her own news. She's always been generous with her attention and support." The comment was perfectly diplomatic, but it also highlighted the irony of the situation in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. Here I was, being praised for my generosity in focusing on my sister's celebration, while my sister and parents had somehow failed to focus on my achievement even briefly enough to read about it. Mrs. Davidson seemed to recognize that she had stumbled into complicated family territory. "Of course, family comes first. Emma, I hope you'll consider speaking at some of our professional women's events. Your story would be incredibly inspiring." "I'd be happy to discuss that," I replied, genuinely touched by her interest and support. Thank you for thinking of me. As Mrs. Davidson moved away to rejoin her own table, I found myself sitting with Linda and Mark in a bubble of awkward silence. They remained standing beside table 12, clearly wanting to say something but uncertain how to proceed. The other guests at our table were pretending not to listen while obviously hanging on every word. We should probably get back to the other guests, Linda said finally, her hostess instincts overriding her personal discomfort. But Emma, we're very proud of you. You know that, right? The question felt like a lifeline thrown to someone who was already safely on shore. Of course, I said, because it was easier than exploring why she felt the need to ask. Mark nodded emphatically. Very proud. We'll definitely read that article this week. After they walked away, Alex leaned over and whispered, "That was interesting." "That's one word for it," I replied, watching my parents return to their hosting duties with perhaps slightly less confidence than they'd displayed earlier in the evening. But Mrs. Davidson's visit had set something in motion that couldn't be easily contained. Word spread through the reception with the efficiency of a well-designed social network. I noticed people looking at me differently, conversations pausing when I walked past, introductions that included references to Emma, who was just featured in Forbes magazine. The information traveled faster than wildfire through a crowd that included business owners, executives, and professionals who understood exactly what Forbes recognition meant. Trevor's father, who owned the successful car dealership chain, made a point of stopping by table 12 during the coffee service. "Emma, I had to come introduce myself properly. Doug Hamilton," he said, extending his hand with the firm grip of someone accustomed to making deals. "I hear congratulations are in order for your business success." "Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. It's been an exciting time. I'd love to hear more about your platform. We're always looking for ways to improve our operational efficiency across our locations. Perhaps we could set up a meeting next week." The conversation that followed was substantive and professional, focused on specific business challenges and potential solutions. Doug Hamilton treated me as a peer, someone whose expertise had value and whose insights could benefit his organization. It was a type of conversation I was accustomed to having in my professional life, but experiencing it at Jessica's wedding surrounded by my extended family felt surreal. Other guests began approaching with similar requests. Linda's neighbor, who ran a successful interior design firm, wanted to discuss how Rodriguez Tech might help streamline her client communication processes. Mark's golf partner, who owned a construction supply company, was interested in exploring project management solutions for his field operations. What had started as Mrs. Davidson's enthusiastic congratulations was evolving into an impromptu networking session. The shift in my social status at the reception was dramatic and immediate. Instead of being the forgotten sister relegated to table 12, I was suddenly the center of business conversations and professional interest. People who had politely ignored me for hours were now seeking introductions and asking thoughtful questions about my work. The invisible woman had become visible in ways that clearly surprised everyone, including myself. I watched Linda and Mark navigate this transformation with visible confusion. They had planned this celebration around Jessica's triumph, carefully orchestrating every detail to showcase their daughter's happiness and their family's success. The emergence of my professional achievements as a topic of significant interest among their guests was disrupting their narrative in ways they hadn't anticipated and didn't know how to manage. Jessica, for her part, seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of conversations happening around her. She remained focused on her wedding celebration, dancing with Trevor and posing for photographs and accepting congratulations from the endless stream of well-wishers. She was living her perfect day exactly as she'd imagined it, and the revelation about my success was happening in a parallel universe that hadn't yet intersected with her awareness. The evening took on a surreal quality as I found myself existing in two completely different social contexts simultaneously. At one level, I was still the marginalized sister sitting at table 12, watching my family celebrate Jessica's marriage with elaborate joy. At another level, I was a successful entrepreneur fielding serious business inquiries and professional congratulations from people who now saw me as someone worth knowing. The contrast became most apparent during the bouquet toss. Jessica's friends and various young women gathered on the dance floor, reaching eagerly for the symbol of future matrimonial bliss. I participated half-heartedly from the back of the group, going through the motions without any real investment in the outcome. When the bouquet landed in my hands almost by accident, the crowd cheered with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for moments of perfect symmetry. "Look at that," the DJ announced over the microphone. "The sister of the bride catches the bouquet. Emma, you might be next." As I held Jessica's bouquet and smiled for the photographer, I realized that this traditional moment of sisterly connection felt completely hollow. Here I was, participating in a ritual about future happiness and success, having just discovered that my actual happiness and success were invisible to the family members who were supposed to care most about my well-being. The reception began winding down around 11 o'clock, with older guests starting to say their goodbyes and younger ones migrating toward the hotel bar for continued celebration. Linda and Mark worked the room efficiently, thanking everyone for coming and accepting final compliments on the beautiful evening they'd created. Jessica and Trevor prepared for their dramatic exit under a shower of sparklers, the perfect conclusion to their perfect day. I found myself helping to coordinate some of the logistics, collecting abandoned champagne glasses and directing guests toward the coat check, falling naturally into the supportive role I'd always played at family events. But tonight these familiar actions felt different, like I was participating in a performance rather than contributing to a celebration. I was going through the motions of being the helpful sister while simultaneously processing the realization that my relationship with my family was fundamentally different from what I'd always believed it to be. Alex and I said our goodbyes to Jessica and Trevor, offering sincere wishes for their happiness and gratitude for being included in their special day. Jessica hugged me with genuine warmth, thanking me for everything I'd done to help make the evening perfect. In that moment she was simply my little sister glowing with happiness and love, and I felt the familiar protective affection that had defined our relationship since childhood. But as we prepared to leave, Linda approached me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "Emma, honey, could I speak with you privately for just a moment?" Alex squeezed my hand and stepped away to retrieve our coats, giving Linda and me space for whatever conversation she felt was necessary. We moved toward a quieter corner of the lobby, away from the clusters of departing guests and the bustle of cleanup activities. "I wanted to talk to you about that Forbes article," Linda began, her voice careful and measured. "I think there might have been some misunderstanding tonight about our awareness of your professional activities." I waited, curious to see how she would attempt to reframe the evening's revelations. "You know we've always supported your career choices," she continued, "even when we didn't fully understand the technical aspects of what you were doing. We're proud of your success, truly. It's just that with the wedding planning and everything else that's been happening, we haven't had time to properly celebrate your achievement." The explanation was reasonable on its surface, but it didn't address the fundamental issue that had been exposed tonight. This wasn't about timing or wedding distractions or technical complexity. This was about a family dynamic that had relegated my accomplishments to the category of things that didn't require attention or acknowledgement. "I understand," I said, because it was easier than challenging her narrative. Tonight was about Jessica, and that's exactly as it should have been. Linda looked relieved, perhaps interpreting my response as acceptance of her explanation. "Exactly, but we should definitely plan something to properly recognize your success. Maybe a nice dinner next week, just family." The offer felt like a consolation prize, a gesture designed to smooth over the awkwardness rather than address its underlying causes. "That's very thoughtful, but not necessary. My work speaks for itself." "Of course it does," Linda said quickly. "We just want you to know how proud we are." As we exchanged final pleasantries and I rejoined Alex for our departure, I realized that this conversation had crystallized something important for me. Linda's attempt to explain away the evening's dynamics revealed that she genuinely didn't understand what had happened or why it mattered. She saw tonight's events as a minor social embarrassment that could be corrected with the right follow-up gestures. But for me, tonight had been a revelation about the limits of family loyalty and the importance of building a life that didn't depend on other people's recognition or approval. I had spent 26 years waiting for my family to see me clearly, and tonight I had finally understood that their vision was limited not by lack of information but by lack of interest in expanding their perspective. The drive home through Austin's quiet streets felt like a transition between worlds. Alex and I talked quietly about the evening's surprises and revelations, processing the strange experience of watching my professional life collide with my family dynamics in such a public setting. The city lights blurred past the car windows as we made our way back to East Austin, leaving behind the elegant celebration and returning to the life we'd built together. As we pulled into my apartment complex, I felt a sense of completion settling over me. Tonight had answered questions I hadn't known I was asking and provided clarity I hadn't realized I needed. The wedding had been beautiful, Jessica had been radiant, and my family had successfully created the kind of celebration they'd always dreamed of hosting. But more importantly, I had discovered that my worth wasn't diminished by their oversight and my success wasn't dependent on their acknowledgement. I was exactly who I had built myself to become, with or without their recognition. And that knowledge felt like the most valuable gift I could have received on this strange and illuminating evening. The morning after Jessica's wedding arrived with the kind of clarity that only comes after major life transitions. I woke up in my East Austin apartment to sunlight streaming through windows that faced a small garden rather than a neighbor's fence, in a space I had chosen and furnished and paid for entirely through my own efforts. The navy dress from the night before hung carefully in my closet, and my phone buzzed with follow-up messages from the business contacts I'd met at the reception. The contrast between my current reality and the family dynamics I'd witnessed 12 hours earlier felt like waking up from a dream that had lasted 26 years. Alex was already up, making coffee in my small kitchen, while reading something on his laptop that had his full attention. When I joined him, he looked up with the kind of smile that suggested he'd been processing the previous evening's events as thoroughly as I had. We'd talked briefly on the drive home, but there was more to unpack about what had transpired at the Driscoll Hotel, more to understand about what it meant for my relationships and my future. "Good morning, Forbes featured entrepreneur," Alex said, handing me a mug of coffee that was exactly the right temperature and strength. "How are you feeling about everything?" The question was simple, but the answer was complex. I felt liberated and melancholy simultaneously, relieved to understand the truth about my family's perception of me, while also grieving the loss of illusions I hadn't realized I'd been maintaining. The previous night had stripped away any remaining hope that my parents might eventually see me as clearly as they saw Jessica, and while that clarity was valuable, it was also painful in ways I was still processing. "I feel like I finally understand something I've been confused about my whole life," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "It's not that they don't love me, it's that they love a version of me that doesn't actually exist." Alex nodded thoughtfully. He'd observed my family dynamics from the outside for 2 years, watching me navigate relationships that seemed to consistently diminish my confidence and self-worth. Last night had provided him with concrete evidence for concerns he'd been too diplomatic to voice directly, and I could see that he was both vindicated in his observations and saddened by their confirmation. "The way they talked about your work," he said carefully, "it was like they were describing someone else's life. $12 million isn't computer consulting, and Forbes recognition isn't a local business story. They genuinely didn't understand what you'd accomplished." That was the piece that had surprised me most about the previous evening. I'd expected my family to minimize my success or redirect attention back to Jessica, but I hadn't anticipated their complete ignorance about the scope and significance of what I'd built. Their dismissal wasn't strategic, it was genuine confusion about what my professional life actually entailed and why it might matter to anyone else. "I don't think they wanted to understand," I replied, recognizing this truth as I spoke it aloud. Understanding would have required them to adjust their story about who we are as a family, and that story is more important to them than accuracy. Alex's laptop chimed with an incoming email, and he glanced at the screen before looking back at me with an expression of amused surprise. "Speaking of your professional life, you might want to check your messages." It looks like last night created some momentum you weren't expecting. I retrieved my phone from the bedroom and found 17 new emails, 12 LinkedIn connection requests, and 6 voicemail messages from numbers I didn't recognize. The business cards I'd exchanged at the reception had apparently been put to immediate use, as wedding guests followed up on conversations about potential partnerships, speaking opportunities, and consulting arrangements. Mrs. Davidson had sent a formal invitation to address the Austin Professional Women's Alliance, and Trevor's father had forwarded my contact information to 3 other business owners who were interested in learning about Rodriguez Tech's platform. More intriguingly, I had received messages from 2 venture capital firms that had heard about my company through their own networks and wanted to schedule meetings about potential investment opportunities. One of them mentioned that they'd been trying to reach me for weeks, but their previous attempts had been filtered out by my assistant as routine solicitations. The Forbes article had apparently elevated my profile in ways that made their outreach more targeted and persistent. The most surprising message came from Dr. Rebecca Chen, a professor at Stanford's Graduate School of Business who specialized in entrepreneurship and innovation. She had seen the Forbes article and was writing to invite me to participate in a panel discussion about young women in technology at an upcoming conference in Silicon Valley. The event would bring together some of the most successful female entrepreneurs in the country, and my inclusion in that group felt both thrilling and surreal. "This is incredible," I told Alex, scrolling through the messages with growing amazement. "It's like the Forbes article opened doors I didn't even know existed." Alex smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had always believed in my potential, even when I'd struggled to see it myself. "This is what happens when your work gets the recognition it deserves. You've been building something remarkable, and now the right people are finally paying attention." As I responded to the most promising opportunities and scheduled follow-up conversations, I realized that my professional life was about to expand in ways that would have been impossible to imagine even a week earlier. The success I'd built quietly and independently was transitioning into something more public and connected, a platform that could open doors not just for Rodriguez Tech, but for other women and entrepreneurs who were working to create their own paths in competitive industries. The irony wasn't lost on me that this transformation was happening the morning after a family celebration where I'd been treated as an afterthought. While Linda and Mark were probably cleaning up reception decorations and reliving the highlights of Jessica's perfect wedding, I was fielding inquiries from Stanford professors and venture capitalists who saw my potential as clearly as my family failed to see it. Around noon, my phone rang with a call from Jessica. She sounded tired but happy, calling from the airport before her honeymoon flight to Tuscany. Her voice carried the dreamy contentment of someone whose dreams had all come true exactly as she'd planned them, and I felt genuinely glad that her wedding had been everything she'd hoped for. "Emma, I just wanted to thank you again for everything last night," she said warmly. "I know being seated at table 12 wasn't ideal, but you were such a good sport about it." Mom said there were some complicated family dynamics with the seating arrangements. The casual reference to table 12 as a minor inconvenience rather than a deliberate slight was so typically Jessica that I almost laughed. She genuinely didn't understand that being seated with distant relatives and strangers might feel hurtful to her sister because she'd never experienced being marginalized or overlooked by her family. Her perspective was shaped by a lifetime of being the center of attention, and she couldn't imagine how different the world looked from the periphery. "The wedding was beautiful," I said truthfully. "You looked absolutely radiant and everything was perfect." "I'm so glad you thought so. And Emma, I heard some people talking about you being in Forbes magazine. That's so exciting. I had no idea you were doing anything so important with your computer work." Her surprise was genuine and innocent, revealing the same lack of awareness that Linda and Mark had displayed. Jessica wasn't deliberately dismissive of my achievements, she simply existed in a bubble where my professional life was invisible because it had never been presented to her as significant or interesting. She'd absorbed the family narrative that positioned her as the accomplished daughter and me as the supportive sister, and she'd never questioned whether that narrative reflected reality. "It's been an interesting time," I said neutrally, not wanting to burden her honeymoon preparations with complex family dynamics. "Focus on your trip and enjoy every moment." After Jessica's call, I spent the afternoon responding to professional inquiries and researching the opportunities that were emerging from my newfound visibility. The Stanford conference looked particularly compelling, featuring speakers whose work I'd admired for years and discussions about topics that aligned perfectly with my interests and expertise. The networking possibilities alone could transform Rodriguez Tech's growth trajectory in ways I'd never imagined possible. Alex joined me for a late lunch at our favorite cafe in East Austin, where we'd spent countless hours over the past 2 years discussing our dreams and ambitions and plans for the future. The familiar setting provided a grounding counterpoint to the surreal developments of the past 24 hours, reminding me that my real life existed in these quiet moments and genuine connections, rather than in the elaborate celebrations and family dramas that had dominated the previous evening. "I've been thinking about what happens next," Alex said as we shared a plate of breakfast tacos and watched the Saturday afternoon crowd of young professionals and artists who populated our neighborhood. "With all these new opportunities emerging, you're going to have some interesting decisions to make." The comment highlighted something I'd been subconsciously processing since waking up that morning. The Forbes recognition and resulting opportunities were creating momentum that could take my career and my life in directions I'd never seriously considered. Speaking at Stanford, working with venture capitalists, expanding Rodriguez Tech into national markets, these possibilities represented a level of professional success that would require significant changes in how I approached my work and my relationships. "I keep thinking about last night," I said, trying to articulate thoughts that were still forming, "not just the family stuff, but the conversations with people like Trevor's father and Mrs. Davidson. There's a whole world of professionals and business owners who see value in what I've built, who want to collaborate and learn and grow together. That world exists completely separately from my family's perception of me." Alex understood the implications immediately. "You're realizing that you don't need their validation to build the life you want." The statement was simple but profound, cutting to the heart of a transformation that had been building for months but crystallized during Jessica's wedding reception. For 26 years, I'd measured my worth against my family's standards and found myself consistently falling short. I'd internalized their indifference as evidence of my own inadequacy, believing that if I could just achieve enough or contribute enough or become enough, they would finally see me as valuable and worthy of their attention and pride. But the Forbes article and the resulting professional opportunities had shown me that my worth wasn't determined by my family's perception. I had built something valuable and meaningful entirely on my own terms, using skills and insights that had developed precisely because I'd learned to function independently of their approval. My success was real and substantial and recognized by people who understood my industry and appreciated my contributions. More importantly, I realized that I had found my tribe among the entrepreneurs and innovators and professionals who valued intelligence and creativity over family connections and social status. These were people who judged me based on my work rather than my position in family hierarchies, who saw potential where my family saw mediocrity, who offered opportunities where my family offered obligations. "I think I'm ready to stop waiting for them to see me differently," I said, the words feeling both liberating and final. "I've spent so much energy hoping they would eventually understand who I really am, but they're not interested in understanding. They're invested in maintaining their version of our family story, and I don't fit into that story the way they've written it." Alex reached across the table and took my hand, providing the kind of steady support that had become the foundation of our relationship. "What does that mean for you practically?" The question forced me to translate emotional insights into concrete decisions, to consider how this new understanding of my family dynamics would affect my choices going forward. I thought about the Stanford conference invitation, the venture capital meetings, the speaking opportunities that could establish me as a thought leader in my field. I thought about the life Alex and I were building together, based on mutual respect and shared ambitions and genuine partnership. I thought about the professional community I'd discovered, where my contributions were valued and my potential was recognized. I think it means I stop trying to make them proud and start focusing on the things that actually matter to me. I said, I accept speaking engagements because they advance my career, not because they might finally impress my parents. I make business decisions based on what's best for Rodriguez Tech, not on what might earn family approval. I build relationships with people who see me clearly, not with people who are determined to see me as something I'm not. The conversation continued as we walked through our neighborhood, past the coffee shops and food trucks and startup offices that represented the Austin we'd fallen in love with. This was our community, the place where we built our professional lives and personal relationship without reference to family expectations or social hierarchies. Here, my success was measured by the value I created and the problems I solved, not by my position relative to Jessica's achievements. That evening, I drafted responses to the most promising professional opportunities that had emerged from the previous night's networking. I accepted Dr. Chen's invitation to speak at Stanford, scheduled meetings with 2 venture capital firms, and agreed to address the Austin Professional Women's Alliance about building successful tech companies. Each commitment represented a step toward a more public and connected professional life, one that would require confidence and visibility that my family had never encouraged but that felt natural and appropriate given my actual accomplishments. As I worked through these responses, I found myself thinking about the version of myself that would emerge from these new opportunities. This Emma would speak confidently about her expertise, accept recognition gracefully, and build relationships based on mutual professional respect. She would exist in a world where her intelligence and creativity were assets rather than quirks, where her success was celebrated rather than minimized, where her potential was recognized and nurtured rather than ignored. This Emma would still love her family, but she wouldn't depend on their love for her sense of self-worth. She would maintain cordial relationships with Linda and Mark and Jessica, attending future celebrations and supporting them through challenges, but she wouldn't sacrifice her own growth for their comfort or limit her ambitions to fit their expectations. She would be kind but boundaried, present but independent, loving but not desperate for their approval. The transformation felt both dramatic and natural, like finally growing into clothes that had always been the right size but had been stored away until I was ready to wear them. The Forbes recognition had provided external validation for work I'd already completed, but more importantly, it had revealed a world of opportunities and connections that existed beyond my family's limited vision of what was possible for me. Alex and I spent Sunday exploring this new landscape of possibilities, researching the Stanford conference speakers, investigating the venture capital firms that had reached out, and dreaming about how Rodriguez Tech might evolve with proper funding and strategic partnerships. The conversations were exciting and energizing, focused on growth and innovation and impact rather than on managing family dynamics or meeting others' expectations. Monday morning brought a return to routine, but with an underlying sense that everything had fundamentally shifted. My colleagues at Rodriguez Tech noticed the change immediately, commenting on my increased confidence and energy as I shared news about the speaking opportunities and investment interest. The team was excited about the possibility of expanding our platform and reaching new markets, and their enthusiasm reinforced my sense that we were building something truly valuable together. Linda called that afternoon, ostensibly to thank me for my help with the wedding, but really to address the awkwardness that had emerged around my Forbes recognition. Her tone was careful and measured, the voice of someone trying to repair a relationship without fully understanding what had gone wrong or why it mattered. "I hope you know how proud we are of your success," she said, echoing the phrase she'd repeated several times at the reception. "We've always supported your career, even when we didn't understand all the technical details." I know you love me, I replied, because that was true, even if their love was conditional and limited, and I love you too, but I think we have different ideas about what support looks like. Linda paused, perhaps recognizing that this conversation was more serious than she'd anticipated. What do you mean? I mean that support involves paying attention to what matters to the other person, not just what matters to you. It means celebrating their achievements, not dismissing them as unimportant. It means making space for their success, not treating it as a distraction from what you think is more interesting. The words were gentle but clear, laying out boundaries I'd never articulated before but had been building toward for years. I wasn't angry with Linda, but I was done pretending that their benign neglect was adequate family support or that their love was sufficient compensation for their indifference to my actual life and accomplishments. Emma, I think you're being unfair, Linda said, her voice taking on the slightly wounded tone she used when she felt criticized. We've always been proud of you. Just because we don't understand technology doesn't mean we don't care about your success. Caring about my success would mean reading the Forbes article when it comes out, not 3 days later when other people start asking you about it. It would mean asking questions about my company, not assuming it's just computer consulting. It would mean seating me with family at Jessica's wedding, not with distant relatives and strangers. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary, a gentle but firm establishment of new expectations for our relationship. I explained that I would continue to participate in family celebrations and maintain loving connections, but that I wouldn't pretend their treatment of me was adequate or acceptable anymore. I wouldn't be angry or resentful, but I also wouldn't sacrifice my own growth and opportunities to manage their comfort with family dynamics they'd created and maintained. Linda's responses revealed the depth of her confusion about what had changed and why it mattered. She genuinely believed that their love was sufficient, that their good intentions should excuse their neglect, that my success should be grateful rather than demanding. She couldn't understand why I needed their recognition when I already had their affection, why their attention mattered when I'd clearly succeeded without it. The call ended with polite but somewhat strained farewells, both of us recognizing that our relationship had shifted in ways that would take time to fully understand and navigate. I felt sad but also relieved, like finally setting down a heavy bag I'd been carrying without realizing how much it weighed. Over the following weeks, my professional life expanded in exactly the ways the Forbes article had suggested it might. The Stanford conference was transformative, connecting me with entrepreneurs and investors and academics who became ongoing collaborators and advisors. The venture capital meetings led to a Series A funding round that positioned Rodriguez Tech for national expansion. The speaking opportunities established me as a respected voice in discussions about innovation and entrepreneurship and women in technology. More importantly, I discovered a community of professionals who shared my values and ambitions, who celebrated each other's successes genuinely and offered support through challenges. These relationships were based on mutual respect and shared interests rather than family obligations or social hierarchies, and they provided the kind of recognition and encouragement I'd spent years hoping to find at home. My family adjusted to these changes with varying degrees of understanding and acceptance. Linda and Mark remained proud but distant, occasionally mentioning my achievements to friends but never engaging deeply with the substance of my work or its implications. Jessica continued to see me as her supportive older sister, someone who would always be available for advice and assistance, but whose own life remained peripheral to her concerns. These relationships didn't disappear, but they settled into a new equilibrium that acknowledged both their limitations and their enduring value. I loved my family and enjoyed their company in appropriate doses, but I no longer depended on their approval for my sense of worth or limited my ambitions to fit their expectations. I had found my place in a larger world that valued what I had to offer, and that knowledge made their oversight tolerable rather than devastating. 6 months after Jessica's wedding, I received an invitation to speak at a major technology conference in San Francisco, sharing the stage with CEOs and innovators whose work had inspired my own journey into entrepreneurship. As I prepared my presentation about building successful companies outside traditional tech hubs, I thought about the woman who had sat at table 12 that evening in Austin, watching her family celebrate her sister's happiness while feeling invisible and unimportant. That woman had believed she needed their recognition to validate her worth, their attention to confirm her success, their approval to justify her ambitions. She had spent 26 years waiting to be seen clearly by people who were determined to see her as something she wasn't, hoping to earn love that was already available but limited by their inability to understand who she really was. The woman preparing to address 1,000 technology professionals in San Francisco had learned that recognition comes from doing excellent work, that success creates its own validation, that the right community will find and celebrate you when you're ready to be found. She had discovered that family love is valuable but not sufficient, that professional accomplishment is meaningful but not dependent on family approval, that building a life worth living requires choosing relationships and opportunities that align with your actual values and potential. The transformation hadn't required dramatic confrontations or painful estrangements. It had simply required the courage to stop waiting for other people's permission to become who she was capable of being, to accept recognition from people who could see her clearly, rather than demanding acknowledgement from people who were committed to seeing her differently. As I walked onto that stage in San Francisco, facing an audience of entrepreneurs and innovators who were there specifically to hear what I had learned and accomplished, I realized that Jessica's wedding had given me exactly the gift I needed. Not the family recognition I'd hoped for, but the clarity to understand that I didn't need their recognition to build something meaningful and valuable and true. The invisible woman had finally become visible, not by changing herself to fit their expectations, but by finding the places and people where she had always belonged. And that visibility was worth more than any seat at any table her family could have offered, because it was based on who she actually was, rather than who they needed her to be. 2 years later, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during those awkward moments at table 12. The envelope arrived on elegant letterhead from the Austin Business Journal, inviting me to be the keynote speaker at their annual Entrepreneurs of Excellence Awards ceremony. The letter mentioned that I'd been selected not only for Rodriguez Tech's continued growth and innovation, but for my role in mentoring other young women in technology, and my contributions to Austin's reputation as an emerging tech hub. The irony wasn't lost on me that this recognition was coming from the same community where my family lived and worked, where Linda volunteered at charity galas and Mark's construction company had built relationships with many of the city's most prominent business leaders. The invisible daughter, who had been relegated to the corner of Jessica's wedding reception, was now being honored as one of Austin's most promising entrepreneurs, and the invitation included a note that the ceremony would be covered by local television and business publications. Alex and I had moved into a house in South Austin by then, a restored craftsman bungalow with a home office where I worked when I wasn't at Rodriguez Tech's expanded downtown headquarters. The company had grown to 43 employees, and our platform was being used by over 200 businesses across Texas and California. The Series F funding had led to a Series B round that valued the company at $85 million, making my stake worth considerably more than the Forbes article had estimated 2 years earlier. More importantly, I had found my place in Austin's entrepreneurial community, serving on advisory boards for 2 other tech startups, and regularly speaking at conferences about building sustainable businesses outside Silicon Valley. The University of Texas had invited me to guest lecture in their computer science and business programs, and I'd established a scholarship fund for first-generation college students studying technology. The professional life I'd built was meaningful and connected, rooted in relationships with people who shared my values and appreciated my contributions. My family's awareness of these developments had evolved slowly and incompletely. Linda occasionally mentioned my success to her friends, usually in the context of having two daughters who had chosen very different paths. Jessica, now a year into her marriage and working part-time for Trevor's family business, sometimes shared my conference photos on social media with proud sister captions. Mark had started asking more specific questions about Rodriguez Tech, though his interest seemed motivated more by curiosity about the business aspects than genuine understanding of the technology we'd developed. But their engagement remained superficial and selective, focused on the achievements that made sense to them, while glossing over the parts of my life that required more complicated understanding. They celebrated the financial success and public recognition, while remaining largely indifferent to the community I'd built, the mentoring relationships I'd developed, and the purpose I'd found in creating opportunities for other entrepreneurs who might otherwise be overlooked. The Austin Business Journal ceremony was scheduled for a Thursday evening in November, and the guest list included many of the city's most influential business leaders, venture capitalists, and successful entrepreneurs. As I prepared my keynote address, I found myself thinking about the journey that had led from table 12 to this podium, from feeling invisible in my own family to being recognized as a leader in my chosen field. The speech I was preparing focused on the importance of building authentic professional communities, of finding mentors and collaborators who see potential rather than just pedigree, of creating opportunities for people whose talents might be overlooked by traditional gatekeepers. These themes had emerged from my own experience of feeling unseen and undervalued, but they resonated with broader challenges facing women and minorities and first-generation entrepreneurs who were working to establish themselves in competitive industries. 3 days before the ceremony, Linda called with news that surprised me. "Emma, honey, I wanted to let you know that your father and I will be attending the Austin Business Journal event. Margaret Patterson mentioned that you're the keynote speaker, and we wouldn't miss such an important recognition of your success." The call was friendly and enthusiastic, but it also highlighted the strange dynamics that continued to define our relationship. Linda and Mark had never attended any of my previous speaking engagements, had never visited Rodriguez Tech's offices, had never expressed interest in the other professional recognition I'd received over the past 2 years. But this particular event was significant to them because it was happening in their social circle, because people they knew would be attending, because my success was finally visible in contexts they understood and valued. "That's wonderful," I replied, genuinely pleased that they wanted to be there. "I'll make sure you receive proper tickets and event information. We're so proud of you," Linda continued, using the phrase that had become her standard response to my achievements. "It's exciting to see you being recognized by such an important organization." The conversation was warm and supportive, but it also reinforced the selective nature of their attention. They were proud of me when my success reflected well on them, when it happened in venues they considered prestigious, when it connected to social networks they cared about. But they remained largely uninterested in the substance of my work, the relationships I'd built, or the impact I was trying to create through my professional activities. Jessica also called to congratulate me on the keynote invitation, having heard about it from Linda. Her enthusiasm was genuine and uncomplicated, reflecting the generous spirit that had always been her most appealing quality. She didn't fully understand what I did professionally, but she was happy that other people recognized it as important and successful. "I'm sorry I can't be there," Jessica said, explaining that she and Trevor were taking a long weekend trip to Dallas for a friend's anniversary party, "but I'll definitely watch any video coverage. I love seeing you get the recognition you deserve." Her support felt authentic and loving, even though it came from the same superficial understanding that had always characterized her awareness of my life. Jessica wasn't deliberately dismissive of my achievements, she simply existed in a world where my professional activities were interesting, but not particularly relevant to her daily concerns. She was happy for my success in the same way she might be happy about a friend's promotion or a neighbor's good news. The evening of the Austin Business Journal ceremony, I chose my outfit carefully, settling on a black dress that was professional and elegant without being flashy. Alex looked handsome in his navy suit, and as we drove toward the Four Seasons Hotel where the event was being held, I felt the kind of nervous anticipation that comes before significant professional milestones. The ballroom was transformed with sophisticated lighting and floral arrangements, creating an atmosphere that celebrated business achievement and entrepreneurial innovation. The guest list included venture capitalists who had funded some of Austin's most successful startups, CEOs of major corporations with headquarters in the city, and entrepreneurs whose companies had put Austin on the national map as a technology hub. Linda and Mark were easy to spot near the reception area, dressed in their most formal attire, and clearly impressed by the elegant setting and distinguished guest list. They had arrived early and positioned themselves strategically to observe the other attendees, and I could see them cataloging the prominent business leaders and social figures they recognized from other community events. When they saw me approaching, their faces lit up with genuine pride and excitement. For once, their enthusiasm seemed proportionate to the actual significance of the occasion, and I felt a warmth toward them that had been complicated by years of feeling unseen, but was rekindled by their obvious joy in my recognition. "Emma, you look absolutely beautiful," Linda said, embracing me with more emotion than she usually displayed at public events. "I can't believe our daughter is the keynote speaker at such a prestigious ceremony." Mark beamed with paternal pride, shaking hands with Alex and commenting on how impressive the guest list was and how honored they felt to be there. For the first time in years, I felt like they were seeing me clearly, recognizing the significance of what I'd built, and genuinely celebrating my achievements without qualification or comparison to Jessica's different but equally valid path. The cocktail reception provided an opportunity for networking and reconnection with colleagues and collaborators I'd worked with over the past several years. Linda and Mark stayed close to me initially, clearly enjoying their association with the evening's keynote speaker and the attention that connection brought them. They met several of the investors who had funded Rodriguez Tech, entrepreneurs I'd mentored, and professors from the University of Texas who had become ongoing advisors for my work. What struck me most was how naturally they adapted to this professional environment when my success was the focus rather than a sidebar. They asked thoughtful questions about my work, listened attentively to explanations of Rodriguez Tech's impact, and expressed genuine interest in the community I'd built. They were capable of understanding and appreciating my achievements when those achievements were being celebrated by people they respected in contexts they valued. Dr. Sarah Winters, my former professor who had become a friend and mentor, spent several minutes talking with Linda and Mark about my graduate school potential and my contributions to the university's entrepreneurship programs. She mentioned that I'd been invited to join the computer science department's advisory board and that my scholarship fund had already supported 12 students in their technology studies. "Emma's been remarkably generous with her time and resources," Dr. Winters told them. "She's created opportunities for so many young women who might otherwise have struggled to find their place in technology. Her impact extends far beyond her own company's success." Linda's response surprised me with its depth and specificity. "We've always known Emma was special, but seeing her work recognized by people like you helps us understand just how significant her contributions have been. We're learning so much about what she's built." The admission was honest and humble, acknowledging both their pride in my success and their previous lack of understanding about its scope and significance. For the first time, Linda seemed genuinely curious about my work rather than politely indifferent, asking follow-up questions about the scholarship program and expressing interest in learning more about Rodriguez Tech's platform and growth trajectory. As the evening progressed toward the awards ceremony, I mingled with other honorees and prepared mentally for my keynote address. The speech I'd written focused on the importance of recognizing potential in unexpected places, of building professional communities that value innovation over convention, of creating opportunities for entrepreneurs whose talents might be overlooked by traditional gatekeepers. The themes resonated deeply with my own journey from feeling invisible at Jessica's wedding to being recognized as a leader in Austin's business community. But they also reflected broader patterns I'd observed among successful entrepreneurs who had built meaningful companies despite facing skepticism or indifference from people who should have supported their ambitions. When I was introduced as the keynote speaker, the applause was warm and sustained, reflecting genuine respect from an audience of peers and colleagues who understood the significance of what I'd accomplished. As I walked to the podium, I caught sight of Linda and Mark in the audience, their faces glowing with pride and attention focused entirely on me in a way I'd rarely experienced during family gatherings. My speech began with a story about feeling invisible and undervalued, about the importance of finding communities that recognize and nurture talent regardless of its source or presentation. I talked about the mentors who had seen potential when I couldn't see it myself, about the colleagues who had collaborated and challenged and supported me through the difficult early stages of building a company. Success isn't just about having good ideas or working hard, I told the audience. It's about finding the people who can see your potential clearly and creating environments where that potential can flourish. Sometimes those people are family members or childhood friends. But sometimes they're strangers who become colleagues, mentors who become advisors, competitors who become collaborators. I shared specific examples of how the Austin entrepreneurial community had embraced and supported my work, how investors had taken chances on an unproven founder, how customers had trusted a new platform developed by a small team. I talked about the responsibility that comes with success, the obligation to create opportunities for others who might be struggling to find their place in competitive industries. The most meaningful recognition doesn't come from being the smartest person in the room or the most accomplished entrepreneur at the event, I continued. It comes from knowing that your work has made space for other people to succeed, that your success has created pathways for others to follow, that your achievements have opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. The speech concluded with a challenge to the audience to look beyond traditional markers of potential, to invest in entrepreneurs whose backgrounds might not fit conventional patterns, to build companies and communities that value innovation and impact over pedigree and presentation. The response was enthusiastic and sustained, with several people approaching afterward to discuss specific mentoring and investment opportunities. But what moved me most was the conversation I had with Linda and Mark after the ceremony. They waited patiently while I spoke with other attendees and exchanged business cards with potential collaborators, and when we finally had a moment together, their pride was unmistakable and their understanding was deeper than I'd expected. "Emma, that speech was remarkable," Mark said, his voice carrying more emotion than he usually allowed in public settings. "I had no idea how much thought and purpose you'd put into building not just your company, but your entire approach to business and community." Linda nodded emphatically. "We've been proud of your success, but tonight helped us understand what that success actually means. You're not just running a profitable company, you're creating opportunities for other people and changing how business gets done in Austin." The recognition felt different from the casual pride they'd expressed in previous conversations about my achievements. This wasn't reflexive parental support or social obligation, it was genuine appreciation for work they finally understood was meaningful and impactful. They had seen me clearly for perhaps the first time, not as Jessica's older sister or as a successful but mysterious tech entrepreneur, but as someone whose professional contributions deserved recognition and respect. "I'm glad you were here to see this," I told them honestly. "It means a lot to have your support, especially when you understand what I'm trying to accomplish." The conversation that followed was more substantive than any discussion we'd ever had about my professional life. Linda asked specific questions about the scholarship program and expressed interest in potentially supporting it through her own volunteer work. Mark wanted to understand more about Rodriguez Tech's growth plans and whether there might be opportunities for collaboration with construction industry clients. More importantly, they seemed to recognize that my success wasn't accidental or temporary, that I had built something sustainable and significant that deserved their ongoing attention and support. They were finally seeing me as I actually was rather than as they had assumed I was, and their recognition felt like a gift I hadn't known I was still hoping to receive. As we prepared to leave the Four Seasons, Linda mentioned that she wanted to visit Rodriguez Tech's offices and meet some of my colleagues to better understand the company I'd built and the community I'd become part of. Mark suggested that we schedule a family dinner where I could talk more about my work and future plans, where they could ask questions and learn about aspects of my life they'd previously ignored or misunderstood. The invitations felt genuine rather than obligatory, reflecting a shift in their understanding of who I was and what my professional life meant to me. They weren't trying to manage their social obligations or repair awkward dynamics, they were expressing authentic curiosity about work they finally recognized as important and impressive. Alex and I drove home through Austin's quiet streets, processing the evening's events and reflecting on how different this celebration had felt from Jessica's wedding reception 2 years earlier. The contrast wasn't just about recognition or professional success, it was about being seen clearly by people whose opinion mattered to me, about building relationships based on mutual respect and shared values, about finding communities that appreciated contributions I was capable of making. That was incredible, Alex said as we pulled into our driveway. Not just the keynote or the recognition, but watching your parents finally understand what you've been building. They looked genuinely proud tonight, not just socially proud. The distinction was important and accurate. Linda and Mark had often expressed pride in my achievements, but their pride had been abstract and distant, based more on social expectations than genuine appreciation. Tonight their pride had been specific and informed, rooted in actual understanding of my work and its significance to the broader community. Over the following months, my relationship with my family evolved in ways that reflected this new understanding. Linda did visit Rodriguez Tech's offices, spending an afternoon meeting my colleagues and learning about our platform's capabilities. She was genuinely impressed by the company culture we'd created and the problems our technology was solving for businesses across multiple industries. Mark began referring potential clients to Rodriguez Tech when his construction projects required sophisticated project management solutions, and several of those referrals became significant accounts for our company. He also started reading the business publications that covered Austin's entrepreneurial community, staying informed about developments in industries he'd previously ignored. Most significantly, they began treating my professional activities as integral to our family story rather than peripheral to it. When Jessica announced her pregnancy the following spring, the family celebration included genuine questions about how I was balancing my business responsibilities with my role as soon-to-be aunt. When they planned family vacations, they considered my speaking schedule and board meeting commitments rather than assuming I could adjust my calendar to accommodate their preferences. Jessica's response to my increased visibility was characteristically generous and uncomplicated. She shared articles about my speaking engagements on social media, mentioned my work proudly to her friends, and began asking more specific questions about Rodriguez Tech when we spent time together. She still didn't fully understand the technical aspects of what I did, but she recognized that other people considered it important and impressive. The transformation wasn't dramatic or complete, but it was meaningful and sustainable. My family had learned to see me clearly, not because I had changed who I was, but because circumstances had forced them to confront evidence of who I had always been. The keynote speech and business journal recognition had provided external validation that they couldn't dismiss or minimize, creating space for relationships based on mutual respect rather than inherited assumptions. 2 years after the Austin Business Journal ceremony, I received another invitation that would have seemed impossible during those early days of feeling invisible and undervalued. The World Economic Forum invited me to participate in their Young Global Leaders program, recognizing entrepreneurs under 40 who were creating significant economic and social impact through their work. The invitation came with opportunities to collaborate with leaders from around the world, to participate in discussions about global economic trends and technological innovation, to contribute to initiatives addressing some of the most pressing challenges facing international business and development. It was recognition on a scale I had never imagined possible when I was building Rodriguez Tech in my small East Austin apartment. Linda called within hours of the announcement appearing in the business press, her excitement genuine and her pride unmistakable. "Emma, this is incredible. The World Economic Forum. We had to look it up to understand what it means, but it's clearly one of the most prestigious recognitions in international business. Her enthusiasm was touching and authentic, reflecting a complete transformation from the woman who had dismissed my Forbes recognition as a local business story. She had learned to appreciate achievements she didn't initially understand, to research contexts that weren't familiar to her, to celebrate success that exceeded her expectations and assumptions. Mark was equally impressed, mentioning that several of his business associates had congratulated him on having a daughter selected for such an elite international program. For the first time, my professional achievements were generating positive attention for our family within their social and business circles, creating symmetry with the pride they'd always felt about Jessica's more conventional successes. Jessica's response was typically generous, posting congratulations on social media and expressing genuine excitement about my selection for the World Economic Forum program. She still didn't fully understand what the recognition meant professionally, but she recognized that it was significant and special, and her support felt authentic and loving. As I prepared for my first World Economic Forum meeting in Switzerland, I reflected on the journey that had led from table 12 at Jessica's wedding to this unprecedented opportunity for international collaboration and impact. The path hadn't been linear or predictable, but it had been authentic, built on work I cared about and relationships with people who shared my values and appreciated my contributions. The invisible woman who had sat among distant relatives and strangers at her sister's wedding reception had finally found her place in communities that valued innovation over convention, potential over pedigree, substance over presentation. She had built something meaningful and sustainable, created opportunities for others, and earned recognition from peers who understood the significance of her contributions. More importantly, she had learned that family love was valuable but not sufficient. That professional accomplishment was meaningful but not dependent on family approval, that building a life worth living required choosing relationships and opportunities that aligned with actual values and potential rather than inherited expectations and assumptions. The girl who had spent 26 years waiting to be seen clearly had finally realized that the right people had been seeing her all along. She just had to find them and learn to see herself through their eyes rather than through the limited vision of people who loved her but couldn't understand her. Standing in that Swiss conference center, surrounded by entrepreneurs and innovators from around the world who were working to solve complex global challenges, I felt grateful for every moment of invisibility that had taught me to rely on my own judgment. Every instance of being underestimated that had motivated me to exceed expectations, every experience of being overlooked that had prepared me to recognize and nurture potential in others who might otherwise remain unseen. The woman who had emerged from table 12 had learned that true recognition comes not from being noticed by people who can't see you clearly, but from building relationships with people who recognize your worth immediately and completely. And that recognition, earned through authentic work and genuine contribution, was worth more than any family approval because it was based on who she actually was rather than who others needed her to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.